Hi, this is Professor Brandon Blankenship, and I'm talking about here the three layers of story. So, a client comes in and starts talking about their particular case, or you learn about it through an investigative report or a witness. And the first thing that we have to do is we have to actually discover all the facts about the story. And so, what we have to do in that circumstance is we have to use some techniques to get those facts so that we're not putting our idea of what happened onto the client's story, or I'm going to call this a protagonist. So the main person of the story is the protagonist. And if I'm not careful, when I meet this protagonist, I'll say, well, tell me what happened. And they'll say, well, I got hit by a truck. And I'll say, what time of day was it? What were you driving? What were they driving? What color was that? What color was it? And what happens is, as soon as I start asking these very closed-ended questions, I start directing the story. And so my ability to find out what really matters in the story is greatly diminished because I don't know the story. I can get a bunch of facts, but I don't know the story yet. So what I do is I use some tools, like tactical empathy is one that I use, and there'll be another video on that to actually help the protagonist tell their story. And while I'm gathering up all these facts, what I'm really looking for is the story, the theme of all the facts, the story that ties all of those facts together, all the meaningful facts, the pertinent facts together, to tell the true story of what happened. And by true story, I really mean, when we get into a courtroom setting, every courtroom case, every action at law has a betrayal. And every action at law has a villain. And so while the protagonist is telling me their story, I'm asking these open-ended questions, and I'm using tactical empathy. I'm using voice inflection. I'm using whatever skills I can possibly deploy other than what I'm used to, which is just interrogating with closed questions, to try to learn and develop a safe environment so that the protagonist can tell me their story, and I can begin to see who the villain really is and who's the betrayal. What is the betrayal here? And sometimes too, there's more than one betrayal, and we have to look for, well, what's the true betrayer here? What's the real villain? And a lot of times the client themselves, the protagonist themselves, they don't know. They think they know. They've targeted somebody in many cases, or an entity or whatever. They've got an idea. They certainly know they've been betrayed, but they don't know themselves. And so part of this process that we're doing is helping them find and discover their own story. That's the first piece. Once we've done that, and we might have some ideas about a story or two or three, and we know a whole bunch of facts, and we got loads and loads and loads of facts, and we might have an idea for a story or two or three, but the work's really just beginning, because the next level, the next layer of story is the layer of strategy. So as we're looking at each story that seems to be starting to formulate, we're going to look at the strategy, that layer, and we're going to ask this question, well, what storyline can we choose that strategically gets us to a destination? So the strategy is, not how to build the house, not how to build the case. The strategy is, what kind of house is this going to be? What's going to be the end result? So in a criminal case, it might be an acquittal or prosecution for a higher crime. In a civil case, it might be a $1 billion verdict or a defense verdict, so that we don't have to pay anything for the defense. So we begin looking at the story strategically, trying to figure out, what is the ultimate thing that we're trying to get in this case. Sometimes I think about that as the win. One of the things that happens in the practice of law is you have to really stop and redefine win, and to kind of illustrate that for you. If you think about in a capital murder case where the government is seeking to have your client executed, then an acquittal, if you get a not guilty verdict, that's a win. But if the jury comes back and says, well, we're not going to convict for a crime that would result in execution, but we're going to convict for a lesser included crime where the penalty might be a long prison sentence, that's not a win-win, but it's not a loss either. Because as long as your client is alive, you're alive to fight another day. And so sometimes we have to redefine win to mean something other than what we originally thought it might mean when we started this lawyer journey. So in that case, the strategy might be different. The strategy might not be an outright acquittal. The strategy might be something other than that. In every case, we have to stop and ask that question. What is our end goal? And which of these stories serves that goal the best? That's the strategic piece that we're trying to do. Now, I've given you a chapter out of Mullet's book on trials on jury persuasion. And the reason I gave you that is because it helps us begin to understand how we're going to develop this strategy. What is our end goal and what story gets us to that end goal through this use of persuasion with the jury. I've also given you the chapter on strategy and trial preparation. Now, we're a long way from preparing for trial, but strategy at this point is very important. If we pick the wrong strategy, then we do a whole bunch of work on a strategy that doesn't work. It won't get us the goal we're trying to achieve. So the second layer of story is the strategic piece, the persuasion piece. How do we actually develop a storyline that will get us to the goal? The third layer of story is the universal story. We're telling this story to a audience. In a jury trial, it's to a jury. In a bench trial, it's to the judge. In the mock trial, it's going to be to a group of lawyers and or non-lawyers who will serve as judge and or jury or both. So regardless of who the audience is, right, we need to be able to tell our story in such a way that it connects with the person who's going to be giving us the verdict or giving us the ruling, or in the case of mock trial, the points. So it's not enough that I tell my story from the very beginning. In my terms, I have to think about, well, what is a universal story? And I think there are three themes that we can be looking for in trying to tell the universal story. And those themes are powerlessness, being alone, and being inadequate. So I'm just going to use real quickly the story of Anthony Ray Hinton. Anthony Ray Hinton's wrongfully put in prison for 29 years, waiting execution. For 29 years, he's locked in a 6x8 cell right outside of the death chamber. And I began talking about that experience, and somebody would say to me, well, there's no way you could ever understand that. And I take issue with that, because what they're saying is there's no such thing as universal story. There's no way I can understand. Well, I've never been on death row, and I've never been incarcerated in a 6x8 cell for an extended period of time. So I certainly don't understand that experience. But when I think about what it must have felt like when detectives showed up at Hinton's home, his mother's home actually, while he was cutting the grass, and they arrested him and put him in handcuffs and put him in the car, and he didn't know why he's even being arrested. What must that feel like? And well, he felt powerless. What do you do when people with badges show up and put handcuffs on you? What does that feel like? And so I had to stop and think, well, is there a time in my life when I felt something happened to me and I felt powerless to do something about it? And the answer to that is yes. It might have been the slightest thing. It might have been a big thing. It might have been a health condition. That a doctor comes in and says, well, I'm sorry, you've got this health condition. And I might think, well, there's no way to overcome that. I'm powerless in response to that. And to whatever degree I've felt powerless, then I can join Anthony Ray Hinton in that feeling. there were times when he originally was fighting the legal system himself, and so he had some inadequate lawyers by their own confession, and so he was frustrated because the people in the courtroom were talking a language he didn't understand, and there were procedures he didn't know and couldn't learn. And so he wanted to do something different, but he was inadequate to do that. And I certainly wouldn't feel that way in a courtroom, but there's a lot of other places that I do feel inadequate. And I have to stop and think about that for my own personal journey. Like, okay, well, when's the last time that I stepped into an arena where I felt inadequate, but I had to step up anyway? And the fear and overwhelm that comes with that. What must that feel like, and what must it have felt like for Anthony Ray Hinton? And I can relate to him in that regard. And then I think about that 6x8 cell closing and being utterly alone. And again, I don't know what that feels like. I've never been locked away and alone in a 6x8 cell, but I have been alone. And I do know what it feels like to not only be alone, but to feel like you're always going to be alone, that nobody's ever going to join you, that somehow you're a social pariah, and that's going to be the definition of your life. And so when I think about Hinton in that cell, I think about, well, I get that part. I know what that feels like. And so now I go and start talking to a judge in a mock trial case, and I start trying to plead my case. Guess what? That judge has felt those same things. And so when I began talking about my case in the context of a universal story, they can relate. And the more they can relate, the more they just have some internal makeup, some humanness that wants to vote my way and wants to vote my client's way. And the more relatable I become, the more universal I become, the more that's true. And so that's the last layer of this, is how do we universalize the story? That is a journey of really vulnerability. I have to reach a place where I'm comfortable enough in my own skin to be able to say, I have felt powerless, inadequate, and alone. And if I'm willing to be that vulnerable, then I can tell a story that's compelling. So those three layers are what we're looking for when we tell a story.